Chapter 20, Buck and John Thornton. John Thornton was alone in camp with only 2 dogs because he was recovering from frozen feet. He was still limping slightly when Buck came into his life. Together, the 2 invalids sat on the riverbank through the warm spring days, listening to the birds and watching the sparkling water. Thornton was expecting his partners to arrive from Dawson soon. After 3,000 miles of travel, Buck was able to rest at last. As his wounds healed, he regained his lost weight and glossy coat. Skeet, a little Irish setter, had taken the responsibility for Buck on his arrival. She had the doctor trait which some dogs possess. She washed and cleansed Buck's wounds like a mother cat washing her kitten. But first, Buck would have resisted these advances if he had had the strength. Later, he looked forward to the morning washing. Nig was Thornton's other dog, a big black fellow, half bloodhound and half deerhound. Both dogs' friendliness amazed Buck. Neither was jealous of Thornton's attention to him, so perhaps the man's kindness had brushed off onto his animals. He saw to them as if they were his children. He romped and played ridiculous games with them. Soon Buck found himself adoring this man. Judge Miller had been a dignified old man, not given to romping with Buck. Buck had liked him and had enjoyed their steady friendship, but he had never experienced the burning passion he now felt for Thornton. It seemed as if all of Buck's life had been storing up loyalty and adoration for such a master. Thornton had a way of taking Buck's head roughly between his large hands and resting his own head on Buck's. Then he would shake Buck's head back and forth, saying, "You old, ugly monster, you wicked, thieving villain of a dog," which was all love talk to the 2 of them. This rough embrace was Buck's greatest delight. Often it seemed as if his heart would burst with joy as it went on. When Hans and Pete, Thornton's partners, arrived, Buck refused to notice them. After he learned that they were close to Thornton, he tolerated them. The men understood Buck's attitude and did not try to force a friendship on him. Nig and Skeet liked all 3 men, pushing their heads under a hand in order to be petted. Thornton, especially, would always respond to this demand. But Buck would not ask for affection. He would only sit near Thornton and watch every expression on his face. Every now and then, Buck's gaze was so intense that it caused Thornton to look into Buck's adoring eyes. The 2 would hold that look for a moment, each one loving the other greatly. Yet even as Buck sat happily by John Thornton's fire, he saw visions of his wild ancestors in the flames, and he heard the call of the wild. At that moment, a hunger stirred in him, a hunger for the time when all dogs were fierce and free, like wolves. Chapter 21, Buck becomes famous. That winter, John Thornton and his partners Pete and Hans traveled to Dawson because their money was getting low. Since Buck followed Thornton everywhere, he was lying nearby when the 3 men were having a drink at a bar. Black Burton, an evil-tempered, malicious man, was also drinking there and had been for some time. He was a bully and never hesitated using his strong fists instead of words. Now he was picking a fight with a tenderfoot. The tenderfoot tried to apologize, but Burton was intent on a fight. He gave the man a rough push. At this, John Thornton stepped in. His strong sense of fairness would not let him watch the innocent tenderfoot suffer. Thornton said a few quiet words, but suddenly Burton swore and struck out, straight from the shoulder. The blow set Thornton spinning. He saved himself from falling by grabbing the rail of the bar. The men around them heard a sound that was neither a bark nor a yelp. One man described it as a roar. They saw Buck's body rise up in the air and leap for Burton's throat. The man saved his life by instinctively throwing out his arm, but Buck's weight threw him to the floor. Buck had bitten his arm and was now going for his throat again. Burton tried to protect himself, but Buck tore at his flesh. As Burton's blood started to flow, the onlookers woke from their amazement and drove Buck off. A doctor hurried forward, while Buck prowled around the crowd, growling furiously and trying to rush back at Burton. The crowd held a trial at once and decided on Buck's fate. Attacking a man was the most serious crime a dog could commit. Their decision was unanimous. Buck had been proved to an unusual degree Buck had been provoked to an unusual degree and was justified in his action. From that moment on, Buck's name became famous in the North. Throughout Alaska, a man's favorite dog was often the topic of conversation. Now, John Thornton was forced to defend Buck against much bragging. Because of Buck's reputation for heroism after his attack on Burton, other men used him as an example for their own dogs to follow and better. During one such conversation, a man started the competition by claiming his dog could start a sled loaded with 500 pounds and walk off with it. Another said that his dog could do 600 pounds. A third jumped in with 700. Then they looked at Thornton to hear what he would say. When Thornton saw their challenging expressions, he rashly said, "That's nothing. Buck can start 1,000 pounds." His listeners stared at him in disbelief. "What?" one exclaimed. "And break out the sled and walk with it for 100 yards? The man was Mathewson, a rich prospector, whose dog could do 700 pounds. Thornton did not hesitate now that he had said it, even though breaking out a sled meant starting it while it was still frozen to the ground. Usually it was the driver who threw his weight from side to side to rock the sled loose. But could a dog do it by himself? "Buck can break out 1,000 pounds and walk 100 yards with it," Thornton claimed, stated calmly. "Well," said Mathewson slowly, "I got $1,000 that says he can't, and here it is." With that, he slammed a bag of gold dust on the table. By now, all other conversation in the room had stopped, and everyone was intent on Thornton's group. Thornton started to flush. His bluff was being called. His tongue had tricked him because he had no idea how much weight Buck could pull, much less break out. But 1,000 pounds was half a ton. Besides, Thornton and his partners had only $200 among the three of them. Mathewson saw his discomfort and gave a slight smile. "I've got a load of flour outside," he said, 20 sacks, each weighing 50 pounds. "I suggest we go out there and see what this wonder dog of yours can do with that 1,000 pounds. Thornton didn't know what to say. Then he saw old Jim O'Brien standing by with the others, waiting to hear his reply. Jim was Thornton's good friend, but he was also rich. Thornton leaned over to him and asked, "Jim, will you lend me $1,000? "Sure I will," answered O'Brien, pulling a sack of gold dust from his back pocket and handing it to Thornton. "But I'm afraid you're going to get beat." With the bet in, the crowd began to cheer, then followed Thornton and Mathewson outside. When Thornton looked at the loaded sled with its team of 10 dogs needed to pull such a weight, his heart sank. The runners of the sled were firmly embedded in the frozen grip on the snow. As the crowd continued to make side bets, the odds against Buck rose from even money to 3-1. One dog move half a ton from a frozen standstill? Impossible. Then Mathewson saw that the crowd agreed with his judgment and were not betting on Buck. He turned to Thornton again. I'll up my bet another 1,000. What do you say?" After a quick conference with Hans and Pete, Thornton bet their $200 at 3-1 odds. Thus, Mathewson was wagering another $600. The 10 dogs were unhitched, and Buck, in his own harness, was put before the loaded sled. Murmurs of admiration arose at his appearance. He was 150 pounds of iron encased in glossy fur. One man was so entranced at the sight of such a magnificent animal that he offered John Thornton $800 for Buck without caring how much the contest came out. Thornton didn't even bother to answer. He waved the man back and knelt at Buck's side. Taking the dog's head in his hands and resting his cheek against Buck's, he whispered, "Pull, Buck. If you love me, pull with everything that's in you." As his answer, Buck seized Thornton's mittened hand between his jaws and held it there for a moment. His sharp teeth were as gentle as silk. It was a gesture that showed Buck's love and determination. Thornton stepped well back. "Now, Buck," he said as Buck watched him. "Now, gee!" Thornton's voice rang out over the silent crowd. Buck swung to the right with a jerk. The plunge of his weight caused the load to quiver. From under the runners arose a crisp crackling sound. "Haw!" commanded Thornton. Buck made the same maneuver to the left. The crackling turned into a snapping. The sled pivoted, and the runners slipped. The sled was broken out. The watching men hardly breathed. The final command came like a pistol shot. "Now, mush!" Buck threw himself forward, tightening the traces with a jarring lunge. His entire body was concentrated in the tremendous effort. His great chest was low to the ground, and his head was forward and down. His feet flew madly, the claws scarring the hard-packed snow into grooves. The sled swayed and trembled. Then it half started forward. The crowd groaned as one of Buck's feet slipped. Then the sled went ahead in a rapid succession of tiny jerks, half an inch, 2 inches. The jerks merged into a glide as Buck gained momentum. The sled was moving steadily. The crowd gasped. Thornton ran behind, encouraging Buck. As Buck neared the 100-yard mark, a pile of firewood, the crowd started to cheer. When Buck passed the firewood, the cheers grew to a roar. Everyone was shouting and throwing hats and mittens into the air, even the loser, Mathewson. Men were shaking hands all around. It did not matter with whom. Over and over they explained to one another how wonderful a thing they had just seen, just as if the listeners had not been there too. Jim O'Brien brought everyone a drink, and they toasted Buck with it. Thornton was on his knees beside Buck, head against head. He was almost choking as he repeated the familiar loving words. "You big old villain, Buck. You wicked monster." The man who had wanted to buy Buck before the contest interrupted Thornton's conversation with Buck. "What a dog! I'll give you $1,200 for him." Thornton rose to his feet. "No, sir. I would sooner sell myself into slavery than part with Buck. Don't ask me again." And that statement, too, became part of the legend in Alaska, when men who had been there told newcomers about the day in Dawson when John Thornton's dog, Buck, broke out a half a ton and walked 100 yards with it. Buck had become famous.